You found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dino here. Time to point and laugh at my pick for DFotY in the year that must not be named. You see, Raw Matt wrote a little article on Synapsids, especially Probanignathes. Let's just say that he can barely get a sentence out without making a mistake. Of course, this was just an article, so I have enlisted the help of a text-to-speech bot, so that way you don't have to just read the text on screen. And for this video, I'll be addressing Matt directly.
Hello, I'm Text-to-Speech Bot 3000, and this is Synapsids by Raw Matt, published October 23rd, 2020, on creationistclothing.com. Synapsids. They use these to show the split from reptiles to mammals.
This is minor, but Matthew, that's a terrible subtitle. First, it has too many pronouns. Second, why do you need a subtitle? Just call the whole thing Debunking the Evolutionary Tale of Synapsids. If you absolutely need a subtitle, then just change it to The Animals that Evolutionists Use to Link Reptiles and Mammals.
All the animals you see on this phylogenetic chart are synapsids. At the top, synapsids, a species of creatures your evolutionists call mammal-like reptiles, and believe gave rise to all modern-day mammals. But here is the thing. Synapsids are not reptiles.
You're right. Synapsids are not reptiles. Reptilia is more or less synonymous with Sauropsida, which is the sister group to Synapsida within Amniota. It's for this reason that researchers no longer tend to use the term mammal-like reptile. And it's also why it's not really fair to say that mammals evolved from reptiles, because none of their ancestors were technically reptiles, although the common ancestor of all amniotes probably would have looked more like a lizard than a rat, so it's easy to see why one might call it a reptile.
So already they are twisting the data to make it appear like evolution is true with wordplay. They are really good at this.
No. Basal synapsids were called reptiles because they had some characteristics, such as the jaw bones you're going to talk about, that were more similar to modern reptiles than to modern mammals. Of course, this is simply because that jaw arrangement is the basal state for tetrapods, that is, all the four-limbed land vertebrates. As it became clear to the scientific community that one shouldn't name groups based on inherited basal characteristics, as that is not very useful, the tendency for professionals to call these animals reptiles has gone away. Now it's really only in popular outlets that you'll hear synapsids called mammal-like reptile, or just reptile.
As you will see, and this is how they built their phylogenies, using cladistics and morphology with few similarities mammals and reptiles have today.
Matt, get an editor, seriously. That was something that would fail as a high school paper, just on grounds of grammar, punctuation, and comprehensibility.
Let me explain. You see, synapsids are mammals, not reptiles.
Excuse me, the f did you just say?
Synapsids are mammals?
No.
Sorry, but that was so mind-bendingly stupid it needed a 3-meme intro for this. Okay, saying synapsids are mammals is like saying birds are eagles. Mammals are a subset of synapsids, a very particular set. So let's go over very quickly what it takes to be a mammal that non-mammalian synapsids lack, and which you can tell about just from fossils. Some big ones are that mammals only have one jawbone per side of the skull, the dentary. Most synapsids retain the basal jaw condition of having a jaw composed of the dentary, angular, syrangular, and articular bone. In mammals, these other jaw bones have gone on to form the inner ear bones, but this is not the case for other synapsids. Another key mammal trait missing in other synapsids is the loss of the anterior dorsal ribs, meaning that the vertebrae of mammals are divided into thoracic and lumbar, whereas in other tetrapods, all the vertebrae anterior to the cervicals are just dorsal until you hit the sacral vertebrae. Here's a gorgonopsid and a wolf skeleton. See how the non-mammal synapsid ribs keep going to the sacrum, but in the wolf there's a distinct rib cage? Yeah, that's one of the ways we know that while gorgonopsids were synapsids, they definitely were not mammals. Now, there are of course things like milk and hair that differentiate modern mammals from other life forms, but it's hard to say who did or did not have these features when you mostly just have bones to work with, so I'm not focusing on that here.
And like modern mammals, synapsid legs were positioned more vertically beneath their bodies than were the sprawling out to the side legs of reptiles.
In fact, yes, the erect limb posture is one of the big things that separates synapsids from other synapsids, such as sphenacodontids, which had a sprawling limb posture, for example the famous Dimetrodon.
Let's not forget their teeth were like dogs today, differentiated into frontal incisors for nipping, with great lateral canines for puncturing and tearing, and molars for grinding food like most omnivores.
First, check your grammar, Uncooked Matthew. You didn't put an apostrophe after the S in dogs, so what the sentence means is that the teeth are like dogs, as in the whole animal, which conjures up the image of a creature with tiny dogs embedded in its mouth. But even with the apostrophe, since it reads awkwardly, you should just add a few more words to clarify. Just say, their teeth were like dogs' teeth today. Problem solved. Seriously, you could sound so much better if you just hired a grammar editor. Heck, I'd do it if you wanted, and I wouldn't even try to fix your bad science until after you published it. Second, this is not a trait of just Therapsids. This goes all the way back to the Synapsids as a group. Heck, the name Dimetrodon means two-measured tooth because of the differentiation in the teeth of the animal. Now, it's true that very derived Synapsids took this tooth specialization to crazy heights like we see in mammals, but it's simply misleading to say that tooth differentiation in Therapsids makes them mammals. If you're going to say that, then you need to accept that your whole erect leg posture thing is worthless.
Also, Therapsids had body hair, whiskers, and bony labyrinth inner ear, and were most likely warm-blooded. Yet, recent studies on Permian coprolites have vindicated this.
Again with the grammar. The word yet implies the thing following it contradicts the thing preceding it, but then you used yet with something that's supposed to support your point. Now to the actual science. You said that Therapsids had hair and whiskers. Well, that might be true of the group as a whole, we simply don't know. You are correct that Permian coprolites do contain hair, so we know that hair was around at the time, but we don't know which animals had it, just that some must have. Perhaps it was all Therapsids, maybe it was all Synapsids, maybe it was just Cynodonts, we just don't know. You can't tell from a Permian coprolite what species the hair and the dung belong to. As for the bony labyrinth inner ear, I'm not even sure what you mean by that. I assume you're referring to the mammal-style ears with 3 ear bones, in which case you mean the middle ear, but the labyrinth-like part of the ear is the cochlea, and that's not bony. Oh, Matt, who could be more digestible if denatured by heat. It seems to me that you don't know the first thing about the anatomy of ears in general, never mind the details of Therapsid ears. Let's go back to the Gorgonopsids, just because they're my favorite non-mammal, non-dinocephalian Therapsid. You see all those bones in the jaw? Like the clearly visible angular bone? Yeah, because that's in the jaw, it can't be in the ear. You see, most Therapsids have the basal jaw condition, and haven't turned their jaw bones into ear bones. As for warm-bloodedness, well, I can't say that you're wrong. They probably were warm-blooded, although we can't tell for sure with all Therapsids. Perhaps some of the dinocephalians were cold-blooded.
As you can see clearly, all these differences should have these creatures separating from the reptiles, yet evolutionists categorize them as the transition from reptiles to mammals.
Well, no. They're the transition from fairly basal tetrapods to mammals, and that's why current scientists aren't really calling them reptiles anymore. It's not accurate and gives a false impression of how evolution works. You know, the exact kind of impression that you're under. Matt, who may be full of parasites that could be killed with cooking?
They should be 2 distinct groups, not one, but here's what they do to link the two. Because synapsids are amniotes, meaning they have babies that are surrounded with membranes called an amnion that prevents loss of moisture like reptiles do, they then classify them as being the same thing and related all because of that.
Leaving aside the bad grammar, yes, Therapsids, all other synapsids, and all reptiles are amniotes. That's not an imagined link. It's another example of how taxonomy can be used to make predictions on the basis of evolution that are then borne out in the fossil record. Interestingly enough, the early members of the reptiles and synapsids have many things in common, like sprawling limbs, no distinct thoracic and lumbar regions, the so-called reptile jaw, etc. It's almost like they diverged from a common ancestor that had all these traits, and then the line leading to mammals changed those traits, while the line leading to reptiles changed other traits, resulting in a branching tree of descent that can be seen in the actual morphology of the animals. Weird how that works out, and was predicted by evolution.
They ignore all differences and find a single commonality, and therefore, boom, it's proof enough that we can now ignore all the other data that disproves it.
It's not a single commonality, I just listed several. And it's also the fact that amniotes share genes in common with each other that they don't share with Lysamphibians, the modern sister group to amniotes. It's also the fact that as we go back into the geological record to see the earliest reptiles and synapsids that we can find, they look nearly identical, being different really only in the number of extra holes in the back of the head that they have. This isn't scientists throwing darts at a wall, hitting the sign that says amnion, and just going with it. This is supported by morphology, genetics, and the fossil record. Sure, you can use your post-hoc rescuing device of common designer, but since it's not falsifiable and makes no novel testable predictions, or at least none that I'm aware of, feel free to point me to some if you can, it's not science, and has no place in serious scientific discourse.
This chart below shows the jawbone configuration. They are trying to show how things evolved by portraying that jaws went from a singular jawbone to 2 different bones, called the squamosal and the dentary.
Too chewy, Matt, you have it completely backwards. This is showing how the line that would lead to mammals went from having 4 bones per side of the jaw to just 1. The squamosal bone isn't part of the jaw, it's part of the cranium. So we see mammal-line animals going from having a normal tetrapod jaw with 4 bones and an articular quadrate joint to having a jaw that has both an articular quadrate and a dentary-squamosal jaw joint, to just a dentary-squamosal jaw joint, and finally to shoving the other jaw bones into the middle ear. You're the kind of guy who doesn't know the right answer to a homework question in the textbook when he's using the teacher's edition, aren't you?
Now let's break this down. They admit they have no idea why several lineages of synapsids evolved new jawbones and others did not.
No.
No lineage evolved new jawbones. They started with the same one as all other tetrapods, and then reduced some of them, and finally some of them moved into the middle ear. As for why this happened, it's actually pretty well established that it was to help with an insectivorous diet. You see, insectivores tend to have narrow jaws with sharp, pointy teeth to crunch through exoskeleton with optimal force. As this happened, it squeezed the angular, syringular, and articular bones of the jaw. This made it more efficient to use muscles and joints around the squamosal and dentary, where muscles were already attached as a result of the ancestral temporal fenestra. Then, when the jaw joint was fully functional, the quadrate articular joint was superfluous. As these bones were already being used for the transmission of sound to the ear, as they are today in reptiles, and they were freed from being needed for jaw articulation, it makes perfect sense that over time they became more specialized for their remaining function. That is, hearing. You know who else is becoming more specialized over time? My patrons and channel members, and I want to take a second to thank them now. I want to take a moment during this first month of a brand new year to thank my patrons and my channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above: Benthoven, Ian Chen, Sphincter of Doom, and Henry Hutanen. You guys really helped me get through the last year, and it was a rough one, and I cannot thank you enough. Now, if anyone here is listening and isn't supporting but would like to, there's a link to my Patreon down in the description, as well as the option to join the channel underneath this video. If those aren't right for you, there's also a Teespring store, and if none of that works for you, please just like and share this video, because that helps this channel grow, and that really helps out.
They think maybe better hearing may have been the cause because they do not believe that anything was created nor created to be different from one another, so they are left with assumptions of the past told by fossils in the ground.
I mean, it's not just an assumption that those bones were used for hearing. In modern mammal embryos, those bones start out in the jaw, like in all other tetrapods, but then they migrate physically into the ear as the embryo develops. In parallel to this, we can see the same migration happening in adult forms in the fossil record. This is precisely what we would expect to see, and it's hard to see what other conclusion we could come to while we're looking at these bones specialize as part of the ear, other than that they were so specializing. What other possible interpretation can you put on it without simply saying, yeah, God just made it look that way?
No one can ever observe, study, or do ever validate any of their stories.
Actually, the jaw transition was a prediction. The story was actually a hypothesis on the evolution of mammal jaws first proposed to have gone through stages we've seen based on embryology. The fossils that confirm that were not found until later. This isn't a just so story, it's a confirmed prediction. You know, the gold standard in science. Far from not being able to validate the story, the fossils are in fact the validation.
All we know for sure is that they found multiple species of therapsids.
And we know for sure that they have the anatomy that evolution predicted, which creationism can't account for with anything but a post hoc rescuing device in the form of appealing to actual magic.
Evolutionists have tried to claim that the oldest basal ancestor of the therapsids was the Tetraceratops insignis, which was found in the lower Permian rock layers.
Some studies have recovered it as the basal-most synapsid known, sure, but others have put it in Sphenacocontidae, and others in Eotheiridae. Since all we have is one skull, it's hard to say. But so what? No one is basing the idea of the evolution of mammals from basal tetrapods on the existence of Tetraceratops alone.
They did this because they wanted evidence of the jaw change because remember, it's all they have.
What? What are you even talking about, Matt, who has not been prepared for consumption? The skull doesn't even have a jaw, so it's not being used for anything to do with the jaw. Plus, plenty of therapsids have stock standard basal tetrapod jaws anyway. We don't need some even earlier synapsid with what would presumably be the same basic jaw structure anyway.
This is what they actually found, and it is not a therapsid.
No, it's not, and I can't find any evidence that anyone ever said it was.
Because of their stupidity, they changed their classification to basal-most therapsid, rendering its phylogenetic placement unclear.
No, some studies have recovered it as the basal-most synapsid. The difference between words is important. All therapsids are synapsids, but not all synapsids are therapsids.
Then a new study by Spindler et al. Concluded no convincing morphological evidence could be made for a therapsid placement of Tetraceratops, so now it's entirely out of the game.
First, when you reference a paper, you need to actually put the source somewhere. Don't worry, I know from checking the Wikipedia page that you got your misunderstood talking points from that this paper is The Skull of Tetraceratops insignis, Synapsida sphenacodontia from 2020, published in Paleovertebrata by Frederick Spindler. On the same note, et al. Is short for et ali or et alia. That's Latin for and others. It means that there are other authors on the paper or work, but that for ease, you're only naming the first listed author. It's not code for, this is totes a legit paper, dog. Dr. Matthew, of the parasites that could be killed with fire but have not been, by even claiming to have a doctorate, you are saying that you managed to get at least past high school, get an undergraduate degree, and presumably a graduate degree, before even attempting to get a postgraduate degree. Are you trying to tell me that in all that time, in which you would have had to write papers that were properly cited, you never had the meaning of et al. Explained to you? Could it be that you actually have no degrees, and perhaps given your evidently tenuous grasp of the English language, did not in fact graduate high school? It's time to stop trying to overturn the scientific consensus and take an adult education class in remedial English. Now on to the actual sciencey stuff. You said that the paper did not find evidence to put Tetraceratops in Therapsida, and you're right. But it has never been recovered as a therapsid, except in the earliest description, but rather it tends to be put in other synapsid groups. What the paper concluded was that it was the basal-most sphenacodontian, which is the sister group to Therapsida, which means that it might be broadly karyotypic of the common ancestor of both lineages, which, if true, is interesting. No one has claimed it is a direct ancestor of mammals, and even if, contra all previous work, Spindler had found it to be a therapsid, that claim would still not be made. Further, it's not out of any gain. It remains an animal that is so basal within Synapsida that its exact placement is unsure, and that itself gives us morphological information about basal synapsids. Spoiler alert, scientists don't at all care about trying to prove evolution to themselves or you. That was done about a century ago, and since then science has no more been concerned with proving it than it has with gravity or the globe shape of the Earth. There's nothing left to prove. That's why the people who bother to pay attention to this so-called debate are mostly people like me, former creationists who are well-read laymen. Because that's all the skill it takes. And those with better skills in the field are best left to make actual scientific progress rather than holding humanity back by invoking magic every time something is found in the fossil record that makes them feel bad.
So what do we do now? Well, they have listed 510 generic names to different species of therapsids. Many have now become invalid, doubtful, nomina dubia, or were not formally published at all.
Who has this list? What is the point of saying how many genera of a fossil therapsid there are? This isn't making a point, it's just a bit of trivia. I will, though, give credit where credit is due. You got the technical term nomen dubium, plural nomina dubia, right. And that's honestly kind of impressive. So much so that I suspect you just read it from the website you got the list from and didn't bother to cite.
So we're dealing with a mammal species.
Dr. Nylor, do you mean to tell me that you are so stunningly ignorant of therapsid systematics and taxonomy as to think that they are all a single species and that they are all mammals? I don't even need to say anything. Anyone who has made it this far into the video already knows that this is quite possibly one of the stupidest things you've ever written. Although, to be fair, you did write that you were a breatharian for a time, so I guess thinking that you don't need food at all is worse than this. Pro tip, don't be a breatharian. It's a good way to starve.
Found worldwide on every continent in nearly every layer. Upper Permian, middle Upper Permian, middle Permian, lower Permian, Upper Triassic, middle Triassic, lower Triassic, lower Triassic, lower Jurassic, middle late Jurassic, late Triassic.
One period of the Paleozoic and 2 of the Mesozoic isn't even close to every layer of the fossil record. But sure, Matt. We'll give you a gold star for being able to name a few broad parts of the geological timescale out of order. Good job, little tyke.
So what does the evidence show us? Well, they moved Stegosaurus into the Therapsid family in 1962, only because it was found in the early Permian.
One single guy, Everett Clare Olson, did that in one study, and has not been widely accepted. But who cares? Stegosaurus is basically a maxilla and a dentary. No one is basing the morphological evolution of mammals on this. Further, I suspect that after hitting that initial paywall hurdle, you didn't bother to actually read that part of Olson's paper, Late Permian Terrestrial Vertebrates, USA and USSR, published in the Transactions of the American Philosophical Society. If you had, you'd see that there was a fairly in-depth comparison of Stegosaurus to the genera Eotitanosuchus, Dimetrodon, Thynosuchus, and Biarmosuchus. Further, the fossil was found earlier in the late Permian than thought, not in the early Permian. You got all of this wrong except for the year the paper was published. I mean, you did bother to go beyond just Google and Wikipedia. Right, Doctor?
This has proven to be very controversial with good reason. This is what they had to resort to. Rock layer placement.
And you say this based on what? because there is actually a technical discussion and diagrams in the paper linking Stegosaurus to basal groups of therapsids. Now, I'm not qualified to judge, but since I actually know what a therapsid is and you evidently don't, let's just say that saying this is all based on nothing is a bit of an exaggeration. But this is also a good place to take a pause. This short article is so bad that it'll take a long time to finish up. That's all for me. Please take the time to like and share this video and subscribe if you haven't already. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur.